The cause of death was initially listed as accidental blunt force trauma due to a fall. However, the medical examiner disagreed with this assessment upon further examination of the deceased's skull fractures. Upon thorough analysis, it became evident that the pattern of injury indicated a comminuted skull fracture, resulting from multiple impact points rather than a single traumatic event. This finding suggested an intentional act rather than an accident, raising questions about the circumstances surrounding the deceased's death. The medical examiner sought to determine the exact sequence and force involved in the injuries by studying the distribution and type of fractures. Microscopic examination revealed fine splintering consistent with high-impact blunt trauma, leading the examiner to conclude that the initial ruling was inconsistent with the forensic evidence at hand. Chapter: Case background. The incident in question occurred on a quiet residential street in suburban Detroit during the early evening hours of October 15, 2023. The deceased was discovered by a neighbor, Ms. Thompson, who reported hearing an unusual commotion late at night and noticed what appeared to be a disturbance outside her home. Upon closer inspection from her window, she observed a figure lying motionless near the sidewalk, prompting immediate notification of emergency services. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and found the deceased partially concealed behind a shrubbery along the roadside, displaying signs of significant trauma consistent with blunt force impact. Initial on-site assessments by medical personnel suggested that the deceased had sustained multiple injuries, including extensive head wounds indicative of severe trauma, leading to an immediate assumption of foul play or accident involving vehicular collision. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and found the deceased partially concealed behind a shrubbery along the roadside, displaying signs of significant trauma consistent with blunt force impact. The scene was secured, and further investigation initiated to determine the precise sequence of events surrounding the incident. Chapter: Initial findings. Upon arrival at the scene, emergency medical personnel noted the body in a prone position near a shattered window frame, consistent with potential blunt force trauma mechanisms. The deceased exhibited multiple lacerations and contusions on the scalp, indicative of significant external impact forces. No immediate signs of defensive wounds were observed, suggesting either surprise or overwhelming force. Initial vital signs indicated no respiratory effort, pulse, or spontaneous movement, leading to a classification of apparent sudden death. Given the nature and extent of visible injuries, further investigation was warranted. A preliminary assessment suggested a comminuted skull fracture with bony fragments intruding into the cranial cavity, likely causing fatal brain injury. Forensic pathologists were promptly notified due to the severity and pattern of injuries inconsistent with accidental causes. The scene's condition, including potential fall hazards and blunt objects nearby, necessitated a thorough examination for evidence corroborating the initial findings. Chapter: Forensic investigation. At the scene, various implements were identified as potential blunt force instruments, including a metal pipe and a wooden bat. These items were meticulously cataloged with digital photographs and collected in sterile packaging under direct supervision to ensure chain of custody integrity. Notably absent was any evidence suggesting a struggle, such as defensive wounds on the deceased's hands or signs of forced entry at the scene. The skull fragments recovered from the vicinity exhibited comminuted fracture patterns consistent with high-energy impact trauma. These were carefully documented and transferred to sterile containers for subsequent forensic analysis in the laboratory setting. Computed tomography, CT, scans revealed multiple comminuted skull fractures indicative of severe blunt force trauma. Microscopic examination of bone fragments confirmed the presence of linear and stellate fracture patterns consistent with impact from a hard, blunt object. Histological sections showed intracranial hemorrhage at sites corresponding to the fracture lines. Energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, EGS, detected elevated levels of calcium and phosphorus within fracture areas, indicative of bone disruption. Mass spectrometry identified hemoglobin degradation products in cerebrospinal fluid samples collected from the ventricular system, confirming subdural hematoma formation post-impact. Tissue analysis also revealed increased concentrations of lactate dehydrogenase, LDH, and creatine kinase, CK, enzymes indicative of cellular damage consistent with traumatic brain injury. The analysis of comminuted skull fractures revealed a complex injury pattern indicative of multiple blunt force impacts at varying intervals prior to death. Initial impact patterns on the frontal region suggest an initial assault, followed by subsequent blows to the occipital and parietal areas. These injuries were further corroborated through microscopic examination of bone fracture lines and hemorrhagic pooling beneath the scalp. Radiocarbon dating techniques and entomological evidence provided a post-mortem interval estimate ranging between 48 to 72 hours. The presence of blowfly larvae in advanced stages confirmed this timeframe with high confidence. Additionally, trace evidence analysis identified fibers from a suspected weapon matching those found on clothing items at the scene. The sequence of events established through forensic findings confirms an escalating assault over several hours rather than a single, fatal incident as initially hypothesized by law enforcement. This timeline contradicts witness statements suggesting a rapid and isolated attack, indicating multiple assailants or prolonged struggle scenarios warrant further investigation. The presence of a comminuted skull fracture at the posterior region of the deceased's cranium indicates multiple impact points from blunt force trauma. Analysis reveals sharp, irregular bone fragments embedded within the dura mater and cerebral tissue, consistent with high-energy impacts likely caused by a heavy object such as a hammer or crowbar. Forensic imaging corroborates this interpretation through detailed fracture patterns and displacement evidence. While the specific weapon remains undetermined, the nature of the injuries strongly suggests intent rather than accidental causation. The expert would testify that these findings are conclusive regarding the cause and manner of death, but interpretive in identifying the exact instrument used. Such testimony will provide a clear forensic narrative without overstepping scientific certainty. Chapter: Resolution upon comprehensive examination of the deceased's skull utilizing both external observation and internal CT scans. A final determination was reached regarding the cause and manner of death. The comminuted skull fracture patterns identified were consistent with blunt force trauma inflicted by a heavy, rounded object, such as a metal pipe or baseball bat. These fractures exhibited multiple irregular bone segments displaced from their original position, indicating significant force application over a localized area. Initial assessment had suggested the possibility of a single traumatic event, but further analysis revealed subtle evidence of secondary impact points and patterns consistent with defensive wounds on the arms, suggesting an altercation prior to death. These fractures exhibited multiple irregular bone segments displaced from their original position, indicating significant force application over a localized area. This shift in understanding was pivotal as it provided context for the sequence of events leading up to the fatal blow. The presence of bilateral rib fractures and lacerations on the deceased's hands corroborated this narrative. Ultimately, the evidence proved that multiple traumas occurred during a violent confrontation, culminating in the comminuted skull fracture as the primary cause of death. This comprehensive review allowed for a more accurate reconstruction of the events surrounding the deceased's demise. Analysis of the comminuted skull fracture in this case underscores the importance of meticulous documentation and comprehensive imaging techniques in forensic pathology. Detailed examination of bone fragments provides critical insight into the nature and sequence of traumatic events, enhancing the accuracy of cause of death determinations. The file remains open,